is we are at a very difficult, a very dangerous place in the life of our nation. However, the things that we're seeing are not a society out of control. The things that we're seeing are the planned efforts of those who for 100 years or even more have been planning to overthrow democratic governments around the world and usher in Marxist socialism. I think that's a polite term for it. It's really just communism. If you ask any Marxist socialist what they say about it, they'll just say socialism is a way station on the road to full-orbed communism. And so what we're seeing with the destruction, the violence on our streets, outrageous claims and efforts to defund the police, the toppling of our nation's history in the form of its statues, so indiscriminately that it's hard to apply any logic to it at all. They'll pull down a statue of a Confederate general and right next to it pull down a statue of an abolitionist who deserves great praise for their role in ending slavery. They don't care what they're pulling down, and that's the important point, I think, for us to make as we look around us. They don't care that they're tearing down the institutions of culture, that they're tearing down our connection to our national heritage, to our connection to a nation founded as a Christian nation in the sense of being built not as a theocracy, but being built on Christian principles and Christian ideals and resting on the Word of God. What we're seeing around us is a plan that's been unfolding for over 60 years. It began even longer than that. It began with the first Supreme Court decision to take the Bible out of schools, prayer out of schools, and to bring about a secular society to try to sever people from their religious moorings. And in addition, to bring about the destruction of the family. Now, some people that I've talked to have really marveled at that and have said, how can that be that that would make any sense at all to bring about the destruction of the family? But if you think about it, the family is not just what we think about as the relationships within a family, the heritage of one generation passed on to another. The family is the storehouse of 90% of the wealth in America. The plan of the leftists is to bring about the destruction of our nation and to do so by bringing chaos into society and by deconstructing the family, driving the father out of the home through no-fault divorce or the so-called sexual revolution where you could find gratification for anything you want, anytime you want it. All of those things have placed the family under enormous duress. But this is all part of the plan to try to make you feel exactly as you feel tonight, that it's all coming unglued, that there's nothing that you can count on. But I say to you this, you can count on the Word of God, and you can count on the genius of the American founding in establishing our institutions not all under one control, but having a tripartite system of government, an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch. And the only way to take over America and to deconstruct that is to take control of all three of those branches. And how does that happen? It happens through elections. And elections are forthcoming, and we're going to talk to you a little bit more about what we're trying to do to bring to bear the knowledge and information that we all need to have to come to the rescue of this great nation.
Thank you, Frank. And of course, we are doing something a little bit experimental here in that we are doing a television conference that's available on YouTube and a telephone conference as well. And so there are a lot of technical aspects of that we have to work with. And one of those is that for the moment, I appear to have lost my connection to our telephone callers. And we very much want to hear your questions. And we know that several of you have submitted your questions. And so we are going to endeavor to reestablish that, which may include actually something as simple as me redialing a number on my telephone here. So we're going to work on that as we go. But Frank, as we discuss this and as we get ready to take questions from our viewers, is not too much to say that we really are seeing an attack on America. When I look in the streets right now, I'm seeing a revolutionary fervor with the tearing down of statues, with this idea that we're going to rewrite our history. We had about 87% of the respondents to our poll question already said they do worry that this could be the end of America. These kinds of statements can seem like overkill. I don't think they are. And based on what you're telling me, I don't think you think they are overstatement either.
I don't. In fact, the people that I've talked to have said to me, I think that the concern that we have over these riots, over the violence, over the seeming anarchy is far greater than any concern that people have over the coronavirus, the pandemic that's made so many of us have to run for the cover of sheltering at home and social distancing and all of these things. We're all grown-ups here. We know how to take care of ourselves. We know how to take care of our children and grandchildren when it comes to safety questions like health issues. But this feels like something different. This feels like something that we may not have an opportunity to control or to escape from. And I don't agree with that supposition. I'm like you. I think we have good reason for 87% of our callers and viewers to have concern about the future of America. I share that concern. I do not, however, share the concern that it'll lead to the end of our nation because of the, as I said in my introductory remarks, because of the genius of the American founding, of the recognition that we are all sinners in the sight of God and that no power should be accrued into any one group of people. So we're excited to be able to take your calls tonight. John, do we have any questions back available to us yet?
We did have a question before we were disconnected from someone who was asking about about federal law enforcement and the deep state and whether we needed to be concerned about federal law enforcement as far as the deep state goes. Of course, you and I know that there are many honest people who work in law enforcement and who work in federal law enforcement. Nevertheless, you have expressed concerns, Frank, and I think it's concerns that we've all shared about some of the things that have happened, particularly within the FBI over the past few years.
John, I'm deeply concerned about the so-called deep state. If there's one mistake that our president made in taking office in January of 2017, it was he was a bit naive about the political appointments that President Obama made in his administration, and President Trump chose to leave many of those people in place rather than, as most administrations do, cleaning house, getting rid of all the political appointees. And so many of those political appointees are in this deep state, and even more so in some aspects of the Department of Justice, they're not political appointees, they're lifetime members, but they've also been through many administrations, and it seems that their take has been to undermine this president. Now, in our Constitution, there is not supposed to be a national police power. The President of the United States doesn't even have the power to call out the National Guard without the consent of the governors. That, too, is by constitutional design. But with the formation of what we call our Department of Justice, there are within the DOJ 13 different law enforcement agencies, from Border and Custom Control to Homeland Security, to the FBI itself, to the Federal Firearms Bureau. All of these agencies are within the purview of the Department of Justice. And so we have a president who has appointed one of the most outstanding attorney generals that this nation has ever seen. How do we know that? Because he served a previous president in that capacity. And so we need to be concerned about the deep state, but the real concern is keeping the appointment power that the president has to continue to put federal judges who adhere to a constitutional mindset, and that's why this next election is so critical.
Now, Frank, you have written a book, and a booklet, I should say, and this is actually going to go to all of our donors. You'll be able to get this. You'll get it in the mail actually within the next few days for the most part. You'll also be able to get it at our website at djkm.org and so forth. But it's called The War on America. And in this booklet, Frank, you look at the left's fourfold plan to strangle freedom, and impose socialism. And I think it's a very prescient book, and it's a very perceptive book in pointing out some of the things that we see happening in front of us. You talk about defining deviancy downward as one of them, destabilizing language, undermining the church, and conditioning behavior. We could take all evening looking through each of those aspects, but let's at least look at a couple of them. And I thought conditioning behavior was very interesting when we talk about the COVID-19 crisis. Things like, the phrases we've all heard, we're all in this together, stay home, stay safe, essential versus non-essential. What do you mean by conditioning behavior? How is that being done, and what is the goal of that?
Well, the idea of conditioning behavior by the speech that you use is somewhat controversial, but there's a great literature that in depth shows the power of language in getting people to obey. And we saw this exhibited in Nazi Germany, the kind of language that was used to vilify the Jews, to create a sense of Germans being under duress by the rest of the world, and they were in one sense. They came out of World War I with a terribly punitive treaty. You might say they deserved it. They started World War I, but that punitive treaty led to World War II. How did it lead to that? Because Adolf Hitler was able to use conditioning language to make the German people think that it was their time to rise again on the world stage. So what have we seen during this time of the coronavirus, particularly the lockdown portion of it? Just as you just said, John, we've seen language like, we're all in this together, which means, from a standpoint of a government making that statement, we're all in this together, you need to do what we tell you to do. And if you don't do it, then you're not with us. You're not together with your neighbor. You're some kind of a radical who only has your own interests at heart. Things that tend to make us fall in line. And if you're not wearing your mask, you must have no concern for anybody else. Much of this language is designed to make us think that we have no choice but to follow the dictates of government. So conditioning language is really behavioral control. And that's one of the left's tactics. One of the tactics is to redefine terminology and take away the meaning that you think it has, and use different meaning and condition your thinking about all of those things.
Excellent, Frank. And the good news is we also now have our connection back up with our questioners, so we'll be able to take some calls here. And we appreciate you waiting, and we appreciate you being patient with us as well, so that we have the opportunity to talk to some of our partners tonight. So let's begin things by talking to Elizabeth. Hello, Elizabeth. Welcome to the program. How are you tonight?
I'm good. Thank you for taking my call.
Thank you very much for calling. What's on your mind tonight?
Well, my question is, the government and President Trump and everybody, we see what's happening every day. It seems to be getting worse, and he has called it terrorism. So why don't we declare war on this Black Lives Matters and the other Marxists and groups that are trying to take over? Why don't we declare war and fight it out and just take back our country?
Elizabeth, that's a sentiment that a lot of people share with you. To say it another way, why aren't we taking strong action against this? Why have local governments given ground and allowed these protesters to do just about anything they wanted to do? Saying it another way is, why don't we declare a war in which we just enforce the existing laws? And I think that President Trump is of a mind to do that, but we have these limitations that we talked about before. There is no national police power, but the Department of Justice controls a tremendous amount of money that funds and supports local law enforcement. There's a lot of ways that it can engage in control. I might remind those of us that are old enough to remember when President Richard Nixon ran for office the first time in 1968, there were riots in Chicago during the Democratic National Convention. There were the very same thing was going on then that we have seen in our streets in the last few weeks. What did President Nixon do? He said, the same thing that President Trump is saying. If the governors of the states will not deal with this, then I'll declare martial law, and I'll bring out not only the National Guard, I'll bring out the armed forces. Now that would be an extreme step in our culture, because we've never used our own army to enforce, except during the Civil War, in the Reconstruction period immediately after the Civil War. We've never used our own army to enforce local laws and conduct of people. But we're at this place where I do believe the president is ready to exercise the full extent of his authority and demand that laws be enforced. Now, there's another piece of this, though, too, Elizabeth, and I don't want to put any burden on you or anybody else listening or watching tonight, but the polls show that 77% of all Americans, we have 87% on this call. This call is a little bit more of a conservative audience than the average American poll would be. 77% of all Americans agree with you, Elizabeth, that we need to enforce these laws, that these are criminal actions, and that if we don't enforce these laws, we leave some laws unaccountable, then we're no longer a nation of laws. And so we need to let our voices be heard at the town hall, at the office of the county commissioners, and let them know that we expect them to enforce the law against all violators, and not some special pass for people that claim some radical leftist slogan as an excuse for what they're doing. And let's be clear that what's happening out there on the streets today is really clearly a threefold effort. The first phase of any of the protests are actually legitimate people. I think we were all disgusted and offended by the death of George Floyd and the manner of his death, and rightly so. And so people that went to the streets to protest that were doing a righteous thing. But what happened at sundown on those days was that Antifa showed up, that the radical leftists showed up, that pallets of bricks appeared in cities all across America. How was that logistical miracle performed without a lot of advanced planning? And when the pallets of bricks appeared, then the Antifa started breaking store windows. And then the people who lived in those communities sadly came out and began to loot those stores. And then Antifa began to burn. I keep saying Antifa, Antifa, Antifa. I could be saying George Soros, George Soros, George Soros. He and his money and his foundations, along with many others, are behind this. And so it really is a tiny little slice of Americans. 77% is an extraordinary number. Do not agree with what's going on the streets of America. That would have to be every Republican and 3/4 of, or 2/3 anyway, of all Democrats to agree with that same idea. And it's because deep under our skin, we are all the same. We have families we want to raise and jobs that we want to do, children and grandchildren to take care of. We want what's best for our communities. A small slice of people are causing the problems, and we need to let our elected officials know that they must stand in the gap and enforce the law. And if they will not, we will hold them accountable.
Excellent, Frank. And we do want to remind our listeners and viewers that you can jump in with your question just by dialing 0, and then you'll be able to still hear the program as you wait on hold to ask your question. Let's get another one in, and we will be taking more as the evening goes on here. This is Dean has a question for us. Good evening, Dean. How are you this evening?
Pretty good, pretty good. Glad to be with you. Thank you.
Glad to have you. Thank you. What's on your mind tonight?
Well, I was wondering on helping with the coming election, and what is DJ Kennedy's Ministries' position on the Faith and Freedom Coalition by Ralph Reed? Is it a positive relationship with them? I was just wondering because about helping their efforts as well. And if it is positive, is there any effort to join forces, so to speak, and combine resources and that sort of thing?
That's a great question, Dean. Thank you for asking it. And Frank, this is something that comes up frequently. People want to know that organizations like ours are pulling in the same direction and working together with other organizations. Of course, we've got an excellent relationship with Ralph Reed, and tell us about that and also about the work that we're planning to do, which also makes a good segue for what we want to also talk about, which is what we're planning to do this fall about these very issues.
Well, Dean, thanks for your question. Ralph Reed's a personal friend. I've known him for many years. He is, of course, was the executive director of the Christian Coalition, which was started by Dr. Pat Robertson many years ago. Ralph is an entrepreneur and a patriot, and he is involved with a lot of different organizations. The organization that you're referring to is a good organization, and it works primarily in the area of voter turnout, using computer databases, using a lot of modern technology that didn't even exist too many election cycles ago. They're able to identify and, quite frankly, can tell even from location data on cell phones who's been to the polls and who hasn't. And they deliver phone calls reminding people. And so Ralph's organization does an excellent job in voter turnout. We all are working for the same thing, and that is to restore freedom in America. Some of us, though, have constraints. Ralph's organization does not have the same constraints that we has. He's able to work on election outcomes. We have to work on communicating to people what the issues mean and educating them about the extent of the left's movement into radical communism and socialism. And we have to give people an understanding. So ours is the educational role. We use our broadcast platform to get the word out. And Ralph, on the other hand, and we're, by the way, not allowed to do, under current law, to do anything to influence elections. Now, we can also encourage voter turnout, but we can't get involved in particular elections because of our tax status. However, we are working on a number of things, and I think between now and the fall, you're going to be very excited to see programming that we're doing, which we think is raising all of these issues to a higher level of awareness, and we're using our national broadcast platform to do so. This coming Sunday, we will premiere nationwide, coast to coast, 7:30 a.m. Sunday morning in the East and in the Pacific Coast as well, our Defend America 2020 special. It is the culmination of an effort that we've been working on for 6 months or more to lay out the issues and help people see exactly what's at stake and to urge them to become engaged in this very critical time for the life of our nation. You know, it's really very simple answer to the question you've raised, Dean, you've raised the question about Ralph and his Get Out the Vote organization. That's exactly the primary issue at stake in this election. Believe it or not, the data shows that if everyone on this call were to take one other person to the polls with them when they vote, that's all you have to do. Find one other person who doesn't have a ride or an older person who needs some support and help to make it through the process. If we all brought one other person to the polls with us, it would change the election outcome in a favorable way. And so this is, again, I keep referring to this, but we thank and praise God that the founders saw that the great corrective, you know, when I was a little boy and I misbehaved on those 2 occasions that I did that in my youth, my father used to say, "Franklin, do you want me to get the belt?" The belt was not a pleasant experience. I only had to experience it a couple times to learn that I didn't want that anymore. And we have a paddle that we can use coming up in November. That paddle is to let those people who have brought about these radical changes in our government know our disapproval by turning them out of office. So it really is about voter turnout. We ought to be thinking about that in our own lives. Who can we influence to get registered if they're not registered and get to the polls? It may make the difference between whether our poll question comes true or not. whether America will remain a nation under God, a nation with the personal and civil freedoms that we have, and the religious freedom to continue to proclaim the gospel.
And speaking of that question that we asked at the outset of the call, Frank, we'll ask it again. Are you concerned that the riots in the street, that what we're seeing could lead ultimately to the end of America? And if you'd like to answer that question, you can push on your telephone 1 for yes, 2 for no, or 3 for not sure or undecided. And right now, 82% of our listeners and viewers are very concerned that this could lead to the end of America. And we are going to take some more calls here. So if you would like to ask Dr. Wright a question, all you need to do is hit 0 on your telephone, and we will take your question and put you in line here and try to get you on the program before we are done here tonight. Press 0 to ask your question, and you'll have the opportunity to wait on hold and hear the program still continue as you wait. Frank, you've mentioned a couple of the things that the ministry is doing before we get back to the phones here. Just to zero in on those a little, I do want to remind people again, this very weekend on Lifetime Television at 7:30 a.m. Eastern Time and Pacific, we are airing a very important program. This is our Defend America 2020 special. And that program is really does take an in-depth look at how the left is attacking their attack on God, their attack on the family through transgender and homosexual issues, and the attack on truth, rewriting our history and so forth. It really is important, and frankly, if we're being honest, it's not inexpensive to put together programming like this. We have the opportunity to educate a nation. Tell us about the importance of this ministry doing that work, and frankly, how unusual it is on a national television basis.
Well, I think there's a high percentage of the people on this call that either know of Dr. Kennedy and his ministry or even watched him many times over the years. He launched this ministry 46 years ago and was committed to doing a number of things with this program. One was to bring a greater awareness of America's Christian heritage and the foundation of the institutions of our culture, but also because he saw that our freedoms were increasingly at risk. He saw the lawsuits at the Supreme Court going all the way back into the late 1940s, early 1950s that were undoing our freedoms and driving religious expression from the public square. And Dr. Kennedy was a wise man. He knew that the inevitable result of these things, taking the prayer out of school, taking Bible reading, taking the Ten Commandments out of courthouses, removing all of those things from the influence that they had for 200 years, nearly 200 years in America, he knew that the withdrawal of a Christian influence from a culture would just mean the strengthening of a secular influence in the culture. So this is the documentary that we're premiering this Sunday is an extraordinary, John is the head of our producers, and they've done an extraordinarily good job with this special. They're also working on another documentary that will air this fall that will focus on the efforts of radical billionaire George Soros in his effort to undermine democracy. I've been on calls for the last 3 weeks with people who know all about the George Soros network intimately and have given us mounds of data about what he's doing to steal the vote, what he's doing to suppress your vote, what he's doing to undo the institutions of culture. And so, in addition to our Defend America 2020 special, we're working on additional programming throughout the fall that will make the choice unmistakable. And the choice that I'm talking about is not Democrat versus Republican. You all have to make your own decisions on those things. But we're going to show you where those two parties stand on the issues. The choice that I'm talking about is, am I going to vote or am I going to sit on my hands and watch our freedoms slip away from us by my own apathy and inactivity?
Amen. And we'll look forward to hearing more, Frank. But first, some more of our listeners are ready to ask a question. We have a question here from William. Let's call William up here. Good evening, William. Welcome to the program. Hello, William.
Yes, hello.
How are you tonight?
Hello.
Hi, William. You'll there's a little bit of a delay there that you'll hear. Yeah.
About voting in write-in vote, room for fraud.
In 2016 and into legitimacy of some to go out and collect polling places as sort of a community service. And the fraud associated with that has been extraordinary with the ballot harvest. And all of the talk that you've heard, it's been a little quiet today. What is this whole idea about mail-in ballots? Of catocracy, I think was her response. And this idea of using the corrupt, they're making to have mail-in ballots. And then Katie barred the door. A friend of mine says that his grandmother, in her whole life, and now that she's dead, she votes Democrat every election. That's the kind of thing we laugh about, but it's real. Integrity of our
Hello, Wanda. How are you?
Well, I'm good. The people here who see what's really going on. I was going to ask you, asking me if I want anything.
Well, that's the risk, Wanda, is in the past, if you didn't go to the polls, I always go to the election day, you could contact the supervisor of elections and request what's called an absentee ballot. It comes back in, they know that it was you that voted. It's been a very viable process for a very long time. We can send you a mail-in ballot. They can use those ballots to very disingenuous ends. So I would say if you can vote in person, it's a great... Wanda, you live in Florida. You said here in Florida there still are a great number of new outbreaks, but it certainly makes people more fearful. So yes, absent prove our undoing.
And Frank, the other part of wanting about who, in the short form, who is George Soros and what makes him worthy of us doing an entire documentary project on him?
A Jew, meaning he's a Jew but has no religious persuasions associated with that. He's an ethnic Jew, I suppose. To get from one George, the streets and Antifa, they're all on the riot. Rent-a-riot, Soros, and of the institutions of culture, family.
We do want to respect everyone's time, but we've had so many people faithfully waiting, and because we had a little bit of a technical issue early on, let's get one more caller in before we wrap things up. Mary has a question for us. Enjoy.
Good. My question quickly is, matter being is tradable.
It is.